Welcome to the Morning Book.
Exploring books one morning at a time.
We're glad you could join us. Today we're diving into, well, quite a heavy but important book.
Yeah, definitely. It's Douglas Murray's On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization.
Right, and it really starts with the horrific events of October 7th in Israel, but then it expands outwards, doesn't it, looking at the bigger picture.
It really does. Murray uses that day as a sort of lens to examine, well, some deeply troubling trends, the nature of that specific terror, and how the world reacted. It's a tough read in places.
No kidding. He really emphasizes right at the start how unprecedented that attack felt. You know, the initial reports were maybe just rocket fire, but the reality was so much bigger.
Much bigger. A coordinated, almost brigade-sized assault. And the timing. I mean, almost exactly 50 years after the Yom Kippur War.
That parallel is chilling, isn't it? Another surprise attack on a major religious holiday. It's hard to ignore that echo.
It really is. And what hit me early on reading his account was the sheer brutality. He references footage shown to journalists. And it's not just the killing, but the cruelty.
Yeah.
The almost celebratory nature of some of it.
Yeah, he gives these really visceral examples, like the attempt to behead someone with a shovel shouting slogans.
Horrific.
The attack on the young women at the army base, the scenes at the Nova Festival. It's just hard to even comprehend.
It is. And then Murray juxtaposes that quite jarringly with the reactions he saw happening almost immediately in some Western cities.
Right. These big anti-Israel protests, but they seem to erupt before Israel had even launched a major response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, a relative lack of protest condemning Hamas specifically.
And alongside that, he notes this spike in anti-Semitic incidents, places like Canada mentioned. It makes you stop and think, like, what's driving that immediate reaction?
It really does. It actually reminded me of that quote he includes from George Weidenfeld. Something really stark about...
Oh, yeah, the idea that there are people who are worse anti-Semites than the Nazis, that's a heavy statement.
It's incredibly strong. It forces you to ask, is this ancient hatred morphing into something else? What did you take from that? Is it about scale or the nature of the hate itself?
I think Murray, through Weidenfeld, might be suggesting a shift. Like, the Nazi goal was industrial extermination, very specific.
Right.
Maybe now in some corners, especially online or in certain ideologies, the dehumanization, the calls for Israel's destruction, maybe it carries a similar or even broader intent in this globalized, interconnected world. It's an uncomfortable idea.
Very uncomfortable. And then Murray pivots, doesn't he? He tackles those accusations you hear leveled against Israel all the time: genocide, ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, those terms are used a lot.
But he brings out figures, statistics, points to the significant growth of the non-Jewish population within Israel and specifically in Jerusalem since '48.
That data definitely challenges those specific accusations head on.
And he doesn't stop there. He talks about the successes of Arab citizens within Israel. Doctors, judges, athletes, politicians.
Right, which complicates the apartheid label some people use.
Exactly. And then he flips the coin, historically speaking.
Yeah.
Reminds readers about the treatment of Jewish populations in many Arab and Muslim countries over the decades. Expulsions, persecution.
It adds that necessary, broader context that often gets lost, I think.
It's crucial context. History is messy, isn't it? He also touches on that perception of Israel being, like, invincible militarily.
Yeah.
A perception shattered on October 7th.
Definitely shattered.
And he even mentions some of those wilder conspiracy theories from the region of Israel using spy sharks or birds.
Right. Those seem almost absurd, but they speak to something, don't they? Maybe a really deep-seated distrust or animosity?
I think so. It probably stems from profound mistrust, maybe willful misunderstanding sometimes. In these polarized conflicts, bizarre narratives can just take hold, fueled by misinformation. It avoids the harder truths.
Yeah, avoids the complexity. He also gives that essential background on 1948, the UN partition plan, and its rejection by Arab states. That's key, because it led directly to the war and displacement on both sides. Arabs within Israel, Jews from Arab lands, shared suffering, often forgotten.
So important to remember. Now, switching gears a bit to Israel's defense setup, they're known for intelligence, right? HUINT, SIGINT.
And Iron Dome, of course. We hear about Iron Dome all the time.
We do. But Murray makes a key point about its limitations, especially against, lots of relatively cheap rockets coming from Gaza.
It highlights that asymmetry, doesn't it? Very expensive defense against a much cheaper, easier to smuggle threat.
Exactly. And to really ground the human cost, he shares some devastating personal stories. The Aviv family in Kibbutz Be'eri.
Oh, that was heartbreaking. Trapped in the safe room, the fire, losing their son. It just gives you a glimpse of the absolute terror people face.
It does. And then there's the story of Vivian Silver.
The peace activist.
Yeah, who spent her life trying to build bridges with Palestinians, murdered in her home that day. The irony is just incredibly bitter.
These stories, they're tough, but they really hammer home that fundamental question Murray keeps coming back to. Who will protect Jewish people?
It echoes Herzl, doesn't it? Still relevant today with anti-Semitism persisting globally.
Sadly, yes. The book then tries to understand the motivation behind Hamas. It profiles Yahya Sinwar, his background, prison time for murder.
Right, and his ideology. Seems deeply rooted in a specific religious interpretation and apparently utterly remorseless.
Sinwar's history is chilling. The book mentions reports of him boasting about killings, even allegedly ordering killings of fellow prisoners while inside.
And the fact he received life-saving medical treatment in Israel, only to pursue this violent path. It just shows the deep complexities.
It really does. Murray also includes accounts from hostage families, like Advar, whose grandmother was taken.
The agony of not knowing. And Tamir's family, the impact on his kids.
And Malki Shem Tov, whose son Omer was at the Nova Festival. That waiting, that tiny bit of hope from a Hamas video. Just unimaginable torture for a parent.
Truly. And Murray doesn't ignore the internal questions in Israel after the attack. The intelligence failure. How did this happen?
Huge question for a country so focused on security.
Yeah, people are still grappling with that. He also gets into the international aid to Gaza.
Yeah.
Significant amounts over the years. And he asks, how much of that actually helped ordinary people versus how much might have benefited Hamas leadership.
He sort of contrasts the image of Gaza as a perpetual disaster zone with reports suggesting, well, maybe not luxury, but a relatively higher standard of living before 2023 than often portrayed. It's nuanced.
It is. And the tunnels. The scale of that network under Gaza is mind-boggling.
Hundreds of miles, apparently, often under civilian buildings, schools, hospitals.
Which creates an impossible military dilemma and raises serious questions about how it was built, often with international materials.
And that awful incident, the Israeli hostages killed by friendly fire.
Tragic.
Followed by reports of Sinwar's apparent disregard for Palestinian civilian deaths. It just highlights the grim moral calculus on all sides.
Yeah. Then the focus shifts to the global reaction. Murray describes what happened on some Western university campuses.
That was pretty shocking to read about. Open support for Hamas, slogans that tipped into antisemitism, even martyr vigils for the attackers.
It seems such a disconnect from how we usually react to terror victims, like after Bataclan or Pulse nightclub.
Absolutely. And those protests outside the Nova Massacre exhibition in New York.
Using concentration camp comparisons against Israel, Murray calls that projection, doesn't he?
Yeah, like accusing the other side of the very thing you might be capable of or that fits your narrative. It's a disturbing psychological insight.
And it was strange to see, as he notes, some far left and far right voices converging on that kind of inflammatory language.
Right, and the whole UNRWA controversy, aid continuing despite credible reports of staff involvement in the attacks, raises huge questions about oversight.
Massive questions. Murray then brings in Vasily Grossman's ideas about anti-Semitism.
How enemies project their own flaws onto Jews. And Grossman's different levels every day, social, state anti-Semitism.
It's a useful framework, I think, for understanding how prejudice works and how it might manifest today as anti-Israel sentiment.
It helps dissect it. And he connects it back historically, too, mentioning figures like Haj Amin al-Husseini and the import of Nazi-style anti-Semitism into parts of the Middle East. Those roots run deep.
They do. But amidst all this darkness, Murray also makes sure to highlight Israeli resilience.
Yes, the story of Adi Baruch, the young photographer killed serving as a reservist. Her final letter was incredibly moving.
Just gut-wrenching, but also shows that spirit,
Yeah. He touches on other things, too, the impact on northern Israel, the displacements, ongoing military operations, and reminding us of Hamas's stated long-term aims.
Which haven't changed. And the contrast he draws. Gadi Eisenkot losing his son and nephew, his dignified grief.
Compared to Sinwar's reported callousness, it really frames the different values in conflict.
And things like the Palestinian Authority naming streets after terrorists. It's a stark reminder of how violence is sometimes glorified.
It is. Towards the end, Murray reflects on Israeli society itself. the divisions before October 7th,
The judicial reform protests.
and then that initial wave of unity right after the attack like we saw in the U.S. after 9/11, though he notes that unity started fraying again later.
These things often do. He acknowledges the war is ongoing, lessons are still being learned, mentions the fighting in Rafah, Sinwar reportedly being killed eventually.
And the reaction of Iris Haim, the mother whose son was mistakenly killed by soldiers, her message to those same soldiers after they were involved in the operation against Sinwar, that was extraordinary.
Truly remarkable, Grace. But then you contrast that again with the reports of some celebrations of October 7th on Western campuses.
Yeah.
It's just chilling. Shows the gap in understanding, or maybe something worse.
It really does. But he ends, or nearly ends, with stories like Izzy, the one-armed sharpshooter going back into service. Stories of resilience.
Yeah, that determination comes through.
So, on democracies and death cults, it's definitely powerful, often deeply uncomfortable reading.
For sure. It really forces you to confront some difficult truths about hatred, about conflicts, complexities, and about those troubling global reactions.
It pushes you to think critically, I think, about the narratives we hear and consume. A really vital read if you're trying to get a handle on the deeper issues around October 7th and what it means for democracies everywhere.
Couldn't agree more.
We definitely encourage listeners to explore this further. There's a link in the show notes if you want to find Douglas Murray's book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, please think about subscribing to The Morning Book.
Yeah, and maybe share it with friends who might find it insightful too.
Thanks so much for joining us as we keep exploring books one morning at a time.